Gen Z is like, look, we don't even know if we want to play this game anymore, that we really need change. And I think that's a message of yours I completely agree with.
Welcome to Design Nerds Anonymous, the podcast that sparks curiosity at the intersection of business and creativity. I'm your host, Amanda Schneider, founder of ThinkLab, speaker on TED.com, and best-selling author of the new book, Work for What's Next. If you're new on this feed, you're likely joining us after hearing Oprah's recent podcast. Our guest today, Jean Twenge, was the featured guest on that episode, and for good reason. She's one of the world's most influential generational researchers. Her latest research and book, called Generations, draws from more than 42 million data points, making it one of the most comprehensive studies of generational differences ever conducted. Now, I had the opportunity to join that conversation with Jean and Oprah as an audience expert, bringing insights from Work for What's Next. And when that recording ended, I realized that there was an entire workplace conversation that we hadn't had time to explore. Because today's conversation really isn't about Gen Z alone. It's about understanding why work feels different today and what that means for all of us. But before we dive into my interview with Jean, I wanted to let everyone in on something special coming to the DNA feed. Beginning in August, we're taking Design Nerds Anonymous live and on the road as part of the Work for What's Next book tour, bringing together researchers, executives, educators, and industry leaders to unpack some of the biggest workplace and cultural shifts shaping organizations today. We'll kick things off with a special milestone in August, the 100th episode of Design Nerds Anonymous, recorded live at our industry's largest trade show. Together, we'll unpack what happened when we created our own Gen Z shadow board and what organizations in any industry can learn from inviting younger voices into the conversation. All right, now today, Jean and I pick up where Oprah left off and go deeper into the questions leaders everywhere are trying to navigate right now. What's actually different about Gen Z? What the data tells us about loyalty, resilience, communication, and workplace expectations. And, perhaps most importantly, what leaders can do about it. Here's my conversation with Jean. I have been deep into your book. It is obviously one of the most comprehensive studies out there. And I know I sent you a copy of my book as well. So we'll dive into both of those things today. But I guess for our listeners, could you start by briefly introducing yourself and your area of expertise?
My name is Jean Twenge. I am a professor of psychology at San Diego State University. And I've been researching generational differences for my whole career, so since the 1990s. And I think we're mostly going to talk about my book, Generations, today, about all 6 living American generations and how technology impacts all of us.
You know, knowing that you've been studying all of these generations, and this is not new to you, some of these generational arguments are not new. But what do you hear as maybe what is new around Gen Z and their challenges with work?
Yeah, there's so many. But Gen Z can be challenging, especially because they're so different from millennials. If you look at some of the generational trends, even though there were definitely differences, Gen X kind of built on what boomers did. Millennials kind of built on what Gen X did. But then Gen Z turned a lot of those trends completely in another direction. And I think that's been kind of disorienting for a lot of people, understandably so. They need a different approach than millennials because their psychological profile is just so different.
One of the things, the way that we, I guess, coded it in our book was what we call the boomerang effect, because you can see it in a lot of our data where things really change with the millennials. I guess as you dive into some of those biggest differences, what are a few of the biggest differences, especially in how they approach work as we look at Gen Z?
One thing is that Gen Z is more likely to say that they want to have a job where they can help other people. So that had actually been kind of sliding across the generations, and then that picked back up. And just for context, the data that I draw from, all data has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is everybody's the same age. They're all high school seniors, and then considering what they want out of a job. So that means age is not in that equation. So it's not just the young people want to help people more. We know that Gen Z, compared to other generations at the same age, want to help people more than, say, millennials or Gen Xers did at that age. So that's one thing that pops up. Another thing that is really prominent that's been going on for a while in terms of the generational differences is work-life balance. What you call this and how you see it depends on your perspective. For a lot of people, it is work-life balance. It's making sure work doesn't take over your life, making sure you have enough time for sleep, or as Gen Z would often put it, mental wellness, basically not killing yourself for work. Some managers would see that as lack of work ethic. So it really just does depend on how you are looking at the problem.
This is probably the number one thing that I get questions about as I'm out and about. And I feel like it's even a lot of what we covered with Oprah, right? Is this concern around the rise in burnout, anxiety, overwhelm with young workers. Many are wondering if we're raising a generation with less resilience. We hear they just don't have the grit that previous generations did. Some even say they have a discomfort with adversity or anything that they have to kind of grit through. What does your data tell us is actually happening here?
Well, one thing that's important, I think, for this conversation is to start with the trends in mental health, because that's been one of the biggest drivers between the differences between particularly millennials and Gen Z at the same age. So this is how I discovered Gen Z was already here, was these big data sets that I work with of young people and seeing that as you get that transition in birth years of those born, say, early 90s who are millennials versus late 90s Gen Z, that's when you start to see the increases in loneliness, anxiety, depression, unhappiness, you name it in terms of mental health. It got worse in that transition from millennials to Gen Z for adolescents and for young adults. So it's not just the kids, it's also entry-level employees up to about the age of 26 or so. We're seeing those increases in even major depression. So I think that really underlies, a lot of these differences. So, and I've noticed this with my undergraduates because I, teach college students. It's at the core of why Gen Z needs a softer touch than millennials did. It is true that they don't have that underlying resilience that millennials had. They don't have the optimism that millennials had. They're much more pessimistic. So, both things are true, that they did grow up in a different environment and then, have these challenges like anxiety and depression. But that doesn't mean that you can say, well, we need to change them and we need to pile on a bunch of stuff because that's what's going to teach them. No, then they'll just quit. So if you're a parent and you have a 12-year-old and you want to build their resilience, that's a better plan. But if you have a 22-year-old or a 25-year-old and you're going to bring them into your organization and then think that you can build up that grit right away, well, that's going to be a tough road.
What caused that and what do we do about it?
Yeah, the what caused it, I think I figured out. The what do we do about it is a little harder. The what caused it at this point is pretty clear. Stuff turned in the early 2010s, particularly for adolescents, and a year or two later for young adults. So around 2012. 2012 happens to be the first year the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. It's also when Facebook bought Instagram, when algorithms started to become more common on social media, when social media just went from kind of optional to almost mandatory, especially for young people. There's also some turnarounds in the data. People also started sleeping less around that time, particularly young people, and they also started spending less time with their friends in person. So you put that together, less sleep, less time with friends in person, more time on a screen. It's a terrible formula for mental health. Completely changed the way that they were spending their lives outside of school and in a way that was worse for mental health. In the workplace, you have to, that first step is understanding, realizing that you don't want to overgeneralize. Not necessarily true that any one individual is going to fit this profile, but there's been a big average shift. So your average Gen Z are much more likely to be depressed and anxious than your average millennial was at the same age, 15 years ago. This is how they're coming in. So I think a lot of it has to do with valuing mental health and wellness and stress reduction. Anything that you can do in those categories, Gen Z really responds to, and taking those things seriously. And it can be really practical stuff like, does your healthcare plan also cover mental health services at the same rate it does for services for physical health? If it doesn't, why not? Gen Zers are going to ask you that. And then also just any other types of things where you can consider the role of mental health. And that's going to come up across the board in a lot of different ways.
Does your data tell us anything about the effect of the pandemic?
So I think the pandemic was an add-on. Look at those trends in mental health, including resilience. I mean, they were well on their way before COVID was ever on the scene. And a lot of those indicators have actually recovered. So if you look at depression, it's on the latest data that we've got, it's back to 2019 levels. It's not back to 2011 levels because the change that happened between 2011 and 2019 was much larger than the change between, say, 2019 and 2021 at the height of the pandemic. So at least in that mental health data, what we're seeing was that the pandemic had an impact, but it's now faded. But the impact of spending a lot more time on social media and a lot less time interacting with people in person is still there. So I think that also informs those ideas around return to work, that there is still that desire for more convenience, having, as I know you mentioned in your book, the flexibility not just of where to work, but when to work. Those are still things that are very, very important, especially to Gen Z, but also to other generations too. That's there. But there's also, now that we're out of the pandemic for many years now, the recognition of, hey, interacting with people face to face has some really good things about it. That we maybe want to go to that hybrid model of being in the office a few days a week so we can meet face to face, so we can talk, so we can build those bonds with each other and actually connect. And then have more flexibility for when and where you work on the other days.
Which I think goes back to that mental health piece, definitely has a piece there. And one of the other things that I talk about in the book is this Gallup study that shows the fall off in engagement of all generations was really sharp in 2020. And we've actually seen a similar fall off in 2024 and the first subsequent fall off in 2025. So the first time we've had 2 years in a row, employee engagement. So this is the Gallup survey. It's measuring all generations. So this is not a Gen Z thing. Actually, the biggest fall off was in the mid-level managers that are trying to translate policy from the top down and, trying to be translators of all the worker bees under them to the people making policy above. But this tells me that this is not just a generational issue. It's kind of a workplace issue. And obviously that's what I present in my book is we can look to Gen Z as these first digital natives. Do they have everything figured out? Absolutely not. Do they have all the answers? No. We still need to filter that through the wisdom of older generations. But could there be clues in Gen Z about a better world for all of us? So I'm curious if any of that from the book kind of struck you or what you see in your data that either mirrors or challenges that.
The way I would parse it, just given what I do, is that there's time period effects and there's generational effects, and they work together. So a time period effect, by definition, affects everyone of all generations equally. Now, it's never going to be completely equal, which is why we also have these generational differences. But I think it does often show up with Gen Z first because they're vocal. And just given their age and their generation, they look at the way things are done in the workplace and go, why do we have to do it that way? And so that's what's really wonderful, about having this perspective on generational differences and realizing that, not all of the differences are bad and a lot of them can really teach us something, is that new perspective that Gen Z brings. Often the ideas that they have are helpful to everybody. So I totally agree with that.
Which is interesting because I will say that's the biggest pushback that I've gotten so far is this is great advice for all of us leaders, but who's teaching Gen Z what they need to know? And so how do you respond to critique like that about what we need to learn from Gen Z versus what Gen Z needs to learn from all of us old folk?
Yeah, I think it has to be both. And you're right, too often it's a focus on only one of those directions. So I see this a lot with just generational differences overall. The older generations are fascinated by younger ones and really want to understand them. And then a lot of times younger generations are like, we don't need to understand you. You're old. You're going to be gone. Like, it's this really terrible attitude sometimes. So it really can go both ways, because you can also get the really negative attitude on the part of older generations or managers of, I'm just giving up. I'm giving up on these young people. They don't know anything, have no work ethic. I just can't do it. They're just too challenging. But we're best off if we're talking to each other, if that communication goes both ways, because I really do think both things are absolutely true. Gen Z has something to contribute. A lot of times their ideas are things that will help everyone, but we can't meet them where they are and then give up on profit and things moving smoothly and the work getting done. It has to be something that's balanced. It has to be something maybe we can give Gen Z what they want, but we also have to, yes, teach them a few things about how things are going to work and professionalism and all that stuff that sometimes, the rumor is can be a little bit lacking. But we can each learn from each other. And I think it always works best that way.
I agree. And what's so interesting about what you said is I do hear that a lot too. The older generations want to understand the younger, but they don't necessarily want to change. So it's almost like marriage counseling, right? And then sometimes the younger ones, they don't even want to understand the older ones. So yeah. I agree. Really using data as a foundation to kind of get these generations talking is what's hugely important. And as we look at, I guess, one of the biggest business challenges all generations can understand and relate to is going to be this idea of loyalty. I think Gen Z often appears less loyal to employers than previous generations. They have shorter tenure, they might switch jobs faster, and generally have some different expectations around work. In your research, what is actually driving that shift, and what do you think most leaders misunderstand about it?
Well, I think the thing that a lot of leaders misunderstand is that it goes both ways. That it may be seen that Gen Z has less loyalty to the company, but companies have less loyalty to their employees now. That standard of staying at the same company isn't dead just because employees now want to change jobs. It's dead because companies reconfigure their workplaces and lay off people. Millennials have the same reputation, by the way. So when I gave my Generations in the Workplace talk 15 years ago, I would hear that about millennials as well. It's not necessarily what they want, though. Like that high school senior survey, they're still likely to say they would like to stay in the same job for their whole career. It's just it's not the way the workplace is set up anymore. And to be fair, a lot of times they come in with expectations that are unrealistic and they are often not prepared. It can be tough for Gen Z because they often come in without, as we were talking about, spending as much time with people in person. So those social skills can be a challenge. Some of the workplace norms, the unwritten norms, can be a problem. They need things spelled out for them a lot more than previous generations did. So I think that's another tip. You might have some expectations and you may need to explicitly tell them about what those expectations are.
Well, and I think that they're changing for all of us, right? We've had hundreds of years to create our norms for a physical work environment, but this digital world is new for all of us in terms of how we communicate, in terms of how the digital and physical worlds come together. And so, I think that is a cultural shift that all of us have to work on, and a reason that, again, we've got to get these generations talking, I would say.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about some of those communication skills. As I talk about digital and physical, one of the things I challenge in my book is this idea of digital natives versus analog natives. It's a concept that I credit to a woman named Hannah Grady-Williams, who originally talked about that in her book. But we often say that younger workers are entering the workplace without these communication skills, maybe lack professionalism or just don't understand that workplace etiquette that other generations maybe were set up to pick up a little bit more naturally. I think that the pandemic and the onset of these digital communication norms that are natural for these digital natives, less natural for all of us analog natives, combined with all of this massive change that we're seeing right now, was a big part of creating that gap. What else do you see that has kind of fed this? And again, I know you don't have all the answers of what to do about it, but what does the data tell us that are clues about what to do about it?
I think this is one of the biggest challenges, and it has not, been discussed enough. Social skills take thousands of hours to develop, and a lot of Gen Z just didn't get those hours just because of the way that they grew up with overprotective parents and not getting their driver's license so they were older and not going out with their friends as much. When they were at school, if phones were allowed, which in most schools that was true up until about 2 years ago, they were looking at their phone during lunch, not talking to friends and classmates. So there's definitely some disconnect here. And I think companies are going to have to do more training around that.
What is the responsibility of schools? What is the responsibility of companies? Because I think some of these communication skills come from, it feels like maybe our education system is not preparing students in the same way for the workplace. And I have two Gen Z and a Gen Alpha son. And I'll say one example is we've been on college tours. One of the tour guides was like, and hey, your paper's due on Tuesday. You need an extension. You just tell them, hey, can I get an extension? And all the professors, they let you do it. And I'm thinking, oh my God, if this is the way our kids are growing up, which it is in high school, on to college, where a deadline is just a soft deadline and we can change it. Like now when those same kids get to the workplace, I can understand why these employers are having these struggles. So what do you see as the role of education? What do you see as the role of kind of the workplace when they get there, and maybe even parenting? Like how are we getting here?
I teach upper division undergraduates. They're in my classroom, and in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, they're going to be in their first, quote, real job after college a lot of times. So what standards can I keep that might, help them in the workplace? And they don't like it, but they don't get extensions in my class. And everybody takes the exam at the same time. If you absolutely have to miss it, we drop that exam. That's how we do. I have 350 students, so that's part of the reason too. But sometimes when I think I'm being mean and I wonder if I should be more empathic and flexible and so on, that's always what I think about is, what is their boss going to say when they're like, oh, I can't do the big presentation then. That's not a good time for me. I'm not up to it. I'm like, that's not going to go over well. This was more in the millennial era, but I had a student say to me, I can't take the final at that time because I'm going to Vegas for my birthday. I'm like, what is your boss going to say in 6 months when you say that about the big presentation or the conference or whatever you have to go to? I'm like, no, not going to be a good scene. So I think both through K through 12 and for college, we need to start holding to deadlines more. And I know why people let it go, because they don't want to be mean and because it is tough to wade through all the excuses and so on. But we're setting a bad precedent, and we're getting a bunch of people used to this idea that deadlines mean nothing, when in the real world, they mean something. And then the social skills piece, I think, is the other big part of it. It's one of the many reasons why I think the idea of no phones during the school day, bell to bell, not just a classroom ban, makes a lot of sense, is that social skills piece. There's been a lot of attention in the last couple of months, like, well, is it going to improve test scores? Is it not? Well, maybe it is. Some researchers found it does. Some find it at least doesn't hurt. But nobody's measured the social skills piece yet. That what a big benefit it is to have, say, high school students talking to each other at lunch instead of being on their phones.
Are there studies starting on that? Because I think that's really interesting, even as we look at the people trying to design these spaces for that human interaction.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody is looking into that, but I think it is definitely another reason to say, hey, the students don't really need their phones. There's not any compelling reason why they have to have their phones during the school day, say in high school. So let's get rid of that. And one of the many benefits is maybe it'll help with their social skills.
I feel like I hear often that Gen Z is very difficult to manage, and it kind of builds on all the things that we've talked about, from social skills, communication skills, lack of loyalty and more willingness to leave. I hear that they need more reassurance. They definitely need more coaching because, maybe they just haven't been prepared in the same way than previous generations. What does your research suggest leaders should understand about how these younger workers maybe respond to management differently?
So one place that I would start is with the understanding the generational differences piece. That when they were in high school and sometimes in college, Gen Z, compared to previous generations, are less likely to have had a paid job, less likely to go out with their friends, less likely to go out on dates, less likely to have a driver's license. All of these adult things, they're just not doing as much, or they're doing them later. They're getting to adulthood without as much experience with independence. They don't have as much experience with making decisions on their own. College campuses, everywhere I go, the staff say, I have more and more students who can't make even simple decisions without texting their parents. So this is the environment that they have been raised in. And I don't think it's useful to debate like whose fault that is or who should we blame, or, well, it's just the way it is. And there's upsides to it too. They're also less likely to drink alcohol and have sex as high school and middle school students. Most people would say that's good. But having a paid job or the driver's license, it's not all bad or all good. It's just that they are taking longer to grow up. There's big advantages to that, but then there's also the downsides, especially once they get to the workplace, that they do need more guidance. They do need step-by-step instructions. They do need more reassurance because they just haven't done as many things on their own in the real world. Maybe they've opened a social media account on their own without their parents knowing and spent a lot of time on it, but a lot of those real world things, they just haven't done as much on their own. And I think that shows up in them, as you said, needing more reassurance, more guidance, more management.
It's so funny to think about because as we go back to, again, that Gallup study looking across all generations, the group with the highest level of disengagements that seems to be struggling the most is those mid-level managers that are often the ones struggling with burnout of just midlife and childcare responsibilities and some of these issues as well that don't have necessarily the time and the patience to coach some of these Gen Zers through. I know that you mentioned training earlier, but is it about training? Is it about creating new experiences? Like, what do we do from here to bridge this gap? Because there's not endless energy and it feels like the world is just moving faster and faster and everyone's getting burnout.
Yeah. Well, I hate to say it, but at least for high school and college students using AI, it's just going to make this worse, not better. I mean, maybe they'll develop skills in using AI, but then they're going to miss out on thinking skills, critical thinking, learning how to write, learning how to think, all these things that can't really be replaced by AI. Because AI works the best when you actually have developed thinking skills, because then you know when it's wrong. Because it's still wrong quite a bit, and you have to be able to figure that out. And if you just take it at face value and go with it, it's going to be slop. And that's not what you want for your business. So I think there are definitely challenges here with that. I mean, look, there's definitely upsides with, Gen Z's facility with technology and how they can navigate their way through some of this stuff where, a lot of us who are older are still scratching our heads a little bit and trying to catch up. But if they miss out on these fundamental skills, then that can be tough. I mean, I think you're right. That's why some of the middle managers are struggling, is they're, not just in their personal life have these challenges of work-life balance, but they're also in that position of having to manage teams where they need a lot of guidance.
And then you spend all this time managing them and developing them. And, one of the studies that I cite says the average tenure of a Gen Zer is going to be 2 years and 3 months. In the interior design industry, project cycles are 3 years. You're not even going to see a project complete before you're leaving and going somewhere else. So how do we turn this into, are there any positives? Is there any silver lining that gives us hope that we're not swimming in a sea of unsolvable problems in the workplace today?
Well, mentorship does go a really long way. So if you look at, say, high school students, Gen Zers fight with their parents a lot less than, say, Gen Xers did at the same age. They are used to being in that role of, they actually get along pretty well with people who are older than them. So they respond to mentorship. So building that relationship, using that softer touch and not being harsh, because they do not respond well to harsh, that can help with that retention piece, which is really crucial because they do need more of that building up into having the skills that they need.
That's interesting because my dad would agree with you that as a Gen Xer, I definitely fought with my parents more than I fight with my son. So maybe I need to toughen up my parenting here. So I guess a couple last questions. I know that you had the chance to read some of the book. Was there anything maybe new in the book that was kind of eye-opening to you as a perspective, or maybe something that you would challenge me on? Obviously, your data sets are much, much larger than mine. I think my approach with this is a lot of storytelling and trying to motivate people to really think about how we connect these generations and look to Gen Z as prototypes for kind of a better future and testing and trying some of these things. Because I think to your point, we're struggling right now. Yeah. And I think that not everyone recognizes that there are generational differences. I think I get pushback a lot that this is just life stage. It's not generation. To them, I'm going to point to your book, because I disagree. But I guess as we look at the challenges that we're in right now, I think where I'd love to find just maybe some commonalities is, what do you see that is an opportunity to do something different about it? Because that's really what I wanted to inspire with my book, is just hope that here's some things to try, but you got to work through it with your team. There's no Ozempic here. This is a diet and exercise plan. If you buy the gym membership, but you don't go to the gym, not going to help you.
Yeah. I mean, I think the two areas are the work-life balance piece, for sure. And I'm not going to say I have a magic bullet for that, but that's why I'm glad that you're challenging that status quo and saying, we have a real reconsideration of work. And I think you can see that in your data. I think you can see it in the data that I work with, especially post-pandemic. It's just, there's so much dissatisfaction, lack of engagement, like you're talking about. And the Gen Z is like, look, we don't even know if we want to play this game anymore, that we really need change. And I think that's, a message of yours I completely agree with. I think on a little bit more of the good news side, one thing that I think Gen Z is really bringing attention to is that piece of mental health and wellness. And a lot more workplaces are paying attention to that. I heard about a company that gives new employees I think it was like a $2,000 wellness grant when they were hired, and they could use it for whatever they wanted. They could buy a better mattress. They could buy air conditioning, whatever it would take for them to be more mentally healthy, maybe pay for therapy. And I thought that was great. I thought that was something that never would have happened 10 years ago. If the workplace can think more about employees, not just as employees, but as human beings, we'd all be better off.
And I love that, because it's another idea that is maybe predicated around Gen Z, but doesn't mean any other generation has to give anything up. It means they get something great too.
Exactly.
Well, last question is, I've mentioned my sons. I have 3 sons. My first is college hunting. He's a junior in high school right now. What is your best advice for Gen Z parents out there?
Well, I'll take it a little bit younger too. So this is my other hat. So I have 3 kids as well. They happen to be all girls. They're 19, 16, and 14. So given the research I've done on Gen Z's mental health and how that's related to technology, my other life outside of doing generations work is I wrote this book called 10 Rules for Raising Kids in a High-Tech World. And so for the 17-year-old, people, when they say, that, you can't put the genie back in the bottle and the ship has sailed on some of this, I always push back on that when the kid is 12 or 14. When they're 17 and about to launch, that's a little bit of a different conversation. But the book is a lot about putting off smartphones, putting off social media as long as you can. Kind of accidentally in my house, we settled on you get your first smartphone when you get your driver's license. So before that, you either have a flip phone or a phone designed for kids that has no social media on it. And just kind of almost accidentally coming up with these solutions, partially in response to the research that I was doing. That's really inspired the book. Also because so much of the advice I saw out there was, I don't know how else to put it, it was squishy. It wasn't very concrete. It wasn't very practical. It was things like, well, when your kid's ready, you can give them a smartphone. What does that mean? I don't know what that means. Yeah. The kid's not going to know what that means either, and they're going to say that they're ready every second of every day. It's actually going to be easier to draw a line in the sand and say, we'll get you a smartphone when you get your driver's license. That's what I've definitely found. So lots of advice in the book. The one piece of advice that I think works for all your kids' ages and younger, and for you and for everybody, no phones in the bedroom overnight. So much great research on how technology disrupts sleep, particularly right before bed. If you're scrolling in bed, it's really bad for sleep. Having that phone on your bedside table, really bad for sleep. And I know what you're thinking. I have to have my phone on that bedside table because it's my alarm clock. I have some advice for you. Buy an alarm clock.
Great advice. No phones in the bedroom. So yeah. I will say we've done well with you don't get a phone until high school. We have a youngest one that still doesn't have a phone yet. It's hard to hold tight when it seems like all their friends don't. And then they start to lose out on some of that social when all their friends are texting and they still have to go through their moms.
The solution is the basic phones designed for kids, because then they can text their friends, but there's no social media, no AI girlfriends, no gambling.
Got it. Fascinating. Well, Jean, thank you so much for your Gen Z advice, your parenting advice, definitely the gift of all this data that you're giving the world. So I'm still weeding through the 43 million data points in your book and really appreciate you coming on the Design Nerds Anonymous podcast today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
A huge thank you to Dr. Jean Twenge for joining me today and for helping us better understand the forces shaping generations, workplaces, and the world. Again, if you're new here, welcome. If you loved the episode today, this is exactly the kind of question we love to explore here on Design Nerds Anonymous. Not just what's changing, but why it's changing and what we should do about it. A reminder that this August, we're taking Design Nerds Anonymous on the road as part of the Work for What's Next book tour. If you're curious about where work is headed next, make sure you're following the podcast Design Nerds Anonymous wherever you get your podcasts, because the conversations are only getting bigger from here. Until next time, stay curious. Design Nerds Anonymous is a proud member of the Surround Podcast Network. Special thanks to the podcast production team, Rachel Senator and Rob Schulte.